On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made a radio announcement declaring Japan's unconditional surrender. The news left the country in shock. Streets went silent, and many couldn't believe the empire had accepted defeat. For civilians, it meant an end to the bombings and the hunger. But for Japan's military and political elite, it marked the beginning of something far worse, as their brutal end was near. These men had guided the war from the very beginning. Some since the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, others through the brutal campaigns in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Now they feared what the Allies might do to them. Many suspected they would be arrested and held responsible for years of violence, including massacres, forced labor, and the treatment of prisoners of war. Inside government buildings, panic set in. Top officials held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Some started burning sensitive files, military orders, secret communications, and records from prisons and occupied territories. They hoped to erase proof of their involvement before Allied investigators arrived. Others vanished from public view. Some put on civilian clothes and tried to hide in rural areas. A few senior officers even attempted to flee the country by boat. Meanwhile, the Allies were preparing to take full control of Japan. On August 30th, 1945, U.S. forces began arriving, starting with the 11th Airborne Division, landing in Atsugi Airfield. Just days later, on September 2nd, Japan formally signed the surrender papers aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. That same month, General Douglas MacArthur landed in Tokyo and set up headquarters at the Daiichi Building, just across from the Imperial Palace. MacArthur wasn't just there to oversee Japan's surrender. His job was to reshape the country completely. One of his earliest and most urgent tasks was to bring war criminals to justice. He authorized the creation of a special international court, known as the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. This court would become the central body responsible for investigating, trying, and sentencing those who had played major roles in Japan's military aggression and atrocities. It was modeled closely after the Nuremberg trials that had just begun in Europe against Nazi officials, but the Tokyo trial would deal with crimes committed across Asia and the Pacific. The IMTFE was officially established in September 1945 and headquartered in Tokyo. Unlike ordinary trials, this court wasn't just a Japanese affair. 11 nations that had fought against Japan during the war participated in the tribunal. Each country sent one judge and one chief prosecutor. The participating countries included the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, Australia, Canada, France, New Zealand, the Netherlands, India, and the Philippines. These judges were chosen to represent the global nature of the war and to bring different legal perspectives into the process. The tribunal defined three main categories of charges. Class A charges were for crimes against peace, meaning those who had planned and initiated the war. Class B charges covered conventional war crimes, such as the execution and torture of prisoners of war, killing of civilians, and destruction of property. Class C charges were for crimes against humanity, which included mass murder, forced labor, and human experimentation. The court had the authority to try individuals for any combination of these charges, depending on their role in the war. One of the first tasks of the tribunal was to compile a comprehensive list of suspects. Investigators gathered reports from across Asia, collected testimonies from survivors, and reviewed thousands of military and government documents that had not been destroyed. This list quickly grew, and top military officers, government ministers, and even diplomats were placed under scrutiny. Arrest orders were carried out across Tokyo and other cities, with many high-ranking officials being pulled from their homes, offices, or hiding places. Among the most significant arrests was Hideki Tojo, Japan's former prime minister and war minister. He had been one of the main architects of Japan's military actions, including the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and had overseen much of the war effort until he was removed from office in 1944. As the arrests continued, other powerful names were brought in. Koki Hirota, who had served as both foreign minister and prime minister before the war, was taken into custody. Though he was a civilian, investigators believed his role in foreign policy and his failure to stop military atrocities made him legally responsible. Heitaro Kimura, a general who had commanded troops in Burma, was known for the harsh treatment of Allied prisoners during the construction of the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway. He was quickly added to the list of major suspects. Seishiro Itagaki, another general with a long history of military leadership in China, was arrested for his role in aggressive campaigns and occupation policies. Then there was Kenji Doihara, an intelligence officer and general who had played a major role in Japan's expansion into Manchuria. Doihara had been deeply involved in the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo and was linked to the secret operations that helped justify Japan's early invasions. Altogether, 28 individuals were officially selected to face Class A charges at the Tokyo Tribunal. They represented the top of Japan's wartime leadership: military generals, admirals, politicians, and bureaucrats. All of them were taken to Sugamo Prison, a high-security facility located in central Tokyo. This prison, once used to hold political prisoners, was now the holding ground for men who had once ruled the empire. On May 3, 1946, the long-awaited trials officially began inside the former War Ministry building in Tokyo. The courtroom had been specially prepared for what was expected to be one of the most significant legal proceedings in modern history. Rows of wooden benches were filled with international judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, clerks, translators, and journalists. The defendants wore plain clothing, remained mostly silent, and showed little emotion as the charges were read out. The legal process was long, technical, and at times very slow. Each of the 11 judges represented a different country, and their legal systems were not the same. This made many parts of the trial difficult to manage. Language differences added another layer of complexity, requiring constant translation between Japanese, English, Russian, Chinese, and other languages. The courtroom sessions lasted for hours every day, and each accused man was given the chance to respond to the charges through their lawyers. Much of the attention in the early months focused on Hideki Tojo. He did not deny that he was deeply involved in Japan's war planning. In fact, he openly accepted responsibility for Japan's military actions. However, he claimed he had been following the decisions of the Japanese government, and that he believed he was acting in the country's best interest. He also said that the emperor had been aware of everything, though he was careful not to directly blame him. His attempt to shift some of the weight of responsibility was rejected by the prosecution, which argued that Tojo had exercised major control over the army and political decisions throughout the conflict. As the trial continued, the prosecutors laid out a vast amount of evidence. They brought forward records showing the use of forced labor in occupied territories, the deliberate killing of civilians, and the horrific treatment of Allied prisoners of war. Photographs, military orders, and captured Japanese documents were submitted to the court. They also introduced written confessions and reports from survivors. Cases from Nanjing, Burma, Manila, Singapore, and other war-torn places were brought forward in detail. More than 400 witnesses testified over the course of the trial, including former military officers, government employees, foreign observers, and survivors of Japanese occupation. After more than 2 years of testimony, documents, legal arguments, and deliberation, the Tokyo trials reached their final verdict on November 12, 1948. The announcement of sentences marked a major turning point, not only for the men on trial, but for Japan's wartime legacy. The courtroom was tense as the final judgments were read. Some of the accused showed no emotion. Others looked down, fully aware that the decisions being delivered were irreversible. The panel of judges had spent months behind closed doors reviewing thousands of pages of evidence and transcripts. Reaching an agreement had not been easy. There were disagreements between judges over interpretations of international law, the weight of certain evidence, and even the fairness of trying individuals for crimes that had not clearly existed in legal terms before the war. In the end, majority votes were used to reach decisions. Of the 28 men originally charged, not all made it to the end of the trial. 2 had died from illness while in custody, and 1 was removed after being declared mentally unfit to stand trial. For those who remained, the sentences varied. 7 were condemned to death. 16 others were sentenced to life in prison. 2 received shorter prison terms, likely due to lower levels of involvement or limited authority during the war. The decision to hand down death sentences to 7 men was not taken lightly. These were the individuals the court believed had played the most central roles in launching the war, committing or allowing atrocities, and shaping Japan's brutal occupation policies. The court concluded that their positions of power and their decisions directly contributed to millions of deaths and unimaginable suffering across Asia and the Pacific. These sentences would not be carried out immediately. The condemned were returned to their cells at Sugamo Prison, where they waited while preparations were made. Appeals were submitted, but were rejected. The Allies made it clear that there would be no pardons. Justice, as defined by the victorious nations, would be enforced. In the early hours of December 23, 1948, while most of Tokyo was still asleep, the final sentences were quietly carried out inside Sugamo Prison. The executions began just before dawn, away from the public eye, and with no fanfare. The prison courtyard had been prepared for the hangings, and the process was carried out with strict control. Only a small number of military officials and medical personnel were present. There were no reporters, no families, and no public announcements until after it was over. The executions were done in sequence, with each man led to the gallows, one by one. The procedures were swift and followed military precision. There were no delays, and no statements made by the condemned. Some went silently, while others showed visible signs of fear, but none resisted. By the end of the morning, all 7 had been executed. The same prison where they had spent more than 2 years awaiting judgment had become the site of their final moments. After the hangings, the bodies were handled with care, but with no ceremony. They were quickly transported to a crematorium in Tokyo under military escort. Once cremated, the ashes were taken out to sea and scattered in the waters of Tokyo Bay. This was a deliberate decision. The Allied authorities wanted to make sure no burial sites could become places of worship or political symbolism. They understood the power that monuments could have, especially in a country where some still viewed these men as patriots. By disposing of the remains in secret and without a trace, the possibility of post-war glorification was effectively removed. The executions closed a dark chapter in Japan's modern history. While the Tokyo trials focused on Japan's highest-ranking political and military leaders, a much broader legal effort was unfolding across Asia and the Pacific. Allied powers launched a series of regional war crimes trials to prosecute thousands of Japanese officers, guards, medical staff, and civilian administrators who had taken part in atrocities during the war. These trials were held in countries that had been directly affected by Japan's occupation, and they dealt with crimes that occurred on the ground, often far from Tokyo but no less horrific. In the Philippines, the U.S. military conducted trials in Manila, targeting those involved in brutal campaigns during the Japanese occupation. One of the most high-profile cases was General Tomoyuki Hamashita, who had led Japanese forces in the Philippines. Although he did not personally order many of the killings, he was held responsible under the doctrine of command responsibility. The court found that he had failed to control his troops during the Battle of Manila, where tens of thousands of civilians were massacred and entire neighborhoods were destroyed. He was sentenced to death and hanged on February 23, 1946. His case set an important legal precedent for holding military leaders accountable for the actions of their subordinates. In China, the nationalist government held dozens of trials in Nanjing, Shanghai, and other cities. These trials addressed a wide range of crimes committed by Japanese troops during their long occupation. Among the men convicted was Hisao Tani, a lieutenant general who had been involved in the Nanjing Massacre of 1937, where tens of thousands of Chinese civilians were murdered. Tani was found guilty and executed in 1947. The Chinese trials also uncovered extensive evidence of forced labor, human experimentation, and destruction of villages, especially in northern China. In Singapore, British authorities organized trials focusing on crimes against Allied prisoners of war. One major investigation was the Burma-Thailand Railway, also known as the Death Railway, where thousands of British, Australian, and Dutch prisoners were forced to work under brutal conditions. Many of the guards and officers responsible for beatings, starvation, and executions were sentenced to death. British prosecutors also looked into abuses in Changi Prison and other detention sites across Southeast Asia. In Papua New Guinea, Australian forces conducted a large number of trials, focusing on atrocities committed against both prisoners of war and native civilians. These trials took place in places like Rabaul, where captured Japanese officers were brought before military courts. Australia tried more than 300 individuals, and while some were sentenced to death, many received long terms of imprisonment for crimes like summary executions, torture, and forced marches. Other trials occurred in countries like Burma, the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, Korea, and Hong Kong. In each case, the trials aimed to bring justice for massacres, forced prostitution, starvation, and illegal killings. Unlike the Tokyo trials, which were centralized and international, these regional trials were carried out by the nations that had suffered under Japanese occupation. They often relied on local witnesses and focused on very specific incidents. By the time the trials ended in 1951, more than 5,700 Japanese nationals had been charged with war crimes in different regions. Out of those, about 984 were executed. Thousands of others received prison sentences, ranging from a few years to life. These proceedings formed one of the largest efforts in history to hold individuals accountable for wartime atrocities and set legal standards for future conflicts. As Japan's surrender became certain in August 1945, a wave of suicides swept through its military and political leadership. For many, the idea of facing arrest, public trial, and possible execution was unbearable. These men had built their careers on loyalty to the emperor, military honor, and the belief that surrender was shameful. Rather than submit to judgment by foreign powers, they chose to end their lives on their own terms. Some committed ritual suicide, or seppuku, a method rooted in samurai tradition, while others used firearms or poison. These acts were seen by some in Japan as a way to maintain dignity, even as the empire collapsed around them. In the days immediately following the surrender announcement, suicide rates among officers spiked, especially those stationed in overseas territories or with high-ranking positions. General Toshizo Nishio, who had held important commands in China during the war, was one such figure. Faced with the likelihood of being called to account for actions taken under his leadership, he chose suicide in late 1945. His death went largely unnoticed in the West, but was part of a wider pattern of officers attempting to escape justice in the final moments of Japan's imperial era. Other prominent suicides included General Korechika Anami, the war minister at the time of surrender. Though not listed among the Tokyo trial defendants, he played a critical role in Japan's decision to accept the terms of surrender. Despite his involvement in the peace process, he took responsibility for the war and committed seppuku on August 15, 1945, just hours after the emperor's announcement. In occupied areas like Korea, Taiwan, and parts of China, Japanese commanders took their lives as Allied forces closed in. Many feared they would be tortured or executed by local resistance fighters or Allied troops. In some cases, entire military units committed group suicides, encouraged by their commanders to avoid disgrace. Suicides were not limited to the highest ranks. Numerous mid-level officers and civilian officials ended their lives quietly, often in their homes, sometimes with their families. Some left behind notes expressing loyalty to the emperor or regret for the war's outcome. Others said nothing at all. These deaths left gaps in the investigations that followed and made it harder to fully uncover who had been responsible for certain crimes. After the investigations in 1948, the focus shifted to the remaining war criminals who had been sentenced to life or fixed prison terms. They were held at Sugamo Prison. Unlike the early chaotic months of occupation, this period inside the prison was quieter and more structured. Daily routines were strict, but uneventful. The men who had once commanded armies and shaped national policies now spent their days behind concrete walls, separated from the country they once ruled. Many of the inmates kept to themselves. They were housed in individual cells and followed a daily schedule that included meals, exercise, and limited work assignments. There were no privileges for rank. Generals and former prime ministers were treated the same as lower-level officials. Mail was censored, visits were rare, and the Japanese public was largely kept in the dark about what life inside Sugamo was like. Some prisoners grew ill over time, especially as age and stress took a toll. Shigenori Togo, who had served as foreign minister during the war and was sentenced to 20 years, died in 1950 from illness while still in custody. Another prisoner, Hirinuma Kirichiro, a former prime minister who had been given a life sentence, died in 1952, also while serving his term. With the Treaty of San Francisco signed in 1951 and coming into effect in April 1952, Japan officially regained its sovereignty. The U.S. occupation ended, but this new independence also brought new challenges, especially when it came to dealing with the legacy of war. As Japan tried to rebuild its economy and re-enter the international community, calls for the release of remaining war criminals began to grow louder. Politicians, families of prisoners, and even some sectors of the public argued that the men imprisoned for war crimes had already paid their dues. Some said continued imprisonment was no longer useful, especially now that Japan was a U.S. ally in the Cold War. Others viewed the sentences as influenced more by politics than by fairness. From 1952 to 1958, under both Japanese pressure and American approval, releases began. Many of the men who had been given life sentences were gradually let go. These decisions were made quietly, sometimes under the label of clemency, and often justified on the basis of age, poor health, or good behavior. The final group of surviving Class A war criminals was released from Sugamo Prison by 1958. No official ceremonies were held, and most of the released prisoners returned to private life without speaking publicly about their past. The releases stirred debate across Japan and in other parts of Asia. Some Japanese saw it as a step toward national healing and reconciliation. But in countries that had suffered under Japanese occupation, the decision caused anger. For survivors of massacres, forced labor, and prison camps, the early release of convicted war criminals felt like a denial of justice. Even while the trials were ongoing, one person remained at the center of public and political discussion: Emperor Hirohito. He had been the symbolic head of Japan throughout the entire war. His name appeared in military orders, and his image was used to inspire soldiers to fight and die for the empire. Yet when the trials began, he was never included as a defendant. Many believed the emperor had at least some responsibility for Japan's aggressive expansion and wartime conduct. Historians and political observers pointed to documents suggesting that Hirohito was regularly briefed on military operations and approved key decisions. However, General Douglas MacArthur made a firm decision not to prosecute him. MacArthur and the U.S. leadership feared that putting Hirohito on trial, or worse, executing him, would spark a national crisis in Japan. They believed it would lead to rebellion, chaos, or resistance to the U.S. occupation. Instead, the American administration chose to use Hirohito as a stabilizing figure. He was allowed to stay on the throne, but was stripped of any political or divine authority. In January 1946, he made a rare public statement, declaring that he was not a living god, a belief that had been promoted throughout the war. This announcement marked a turning point in Japan's cultural and political structure. The emperor became a symbolic figure under the new constitution, with no direct role in government or military matters. Still, the decision to shield Hirohito from prosecution has remained controversial. Critics argue that justice was not fully served because the most powerful figure in wartime Japan avoided responsibility entirely. Survivors of the war, especially in countries that experienced brutal occupations, viewed his protection as a political compromise that denied them full accountability. Despite these concerns, Hirohito remained emperor until his death in 1989. After the last prisoners were released, Japan tried to move on. Many of the former leaders faded from public life. Some never spoke about the war again. For decades, Japanese textbooks avoided deep discussions of war crimes. Monuments to victims in China, Korea, and the Philippines still tell a different story. In Japan, Yasukuni Shrine honors the country's war dead. Among them are 14 Class A war criminals, including Tojo. This has caused major tension with countries like China and South Korea, especially when Japanese politicians visit the shrine.